Right now, I'd like to extend the floor to Marin R. Sullivan. Marin is the director of the Harry Bertoia Catalogue Raisonné and is co-curator of the Harry Bertoia Sculpting Mid-Century Modern Life exhibition organized by the Nashville Sculpture Center. She specializes in the histories of modern contemporary sculpture, especially its interdisciplinary, intermedial dialogues with photography, design, and the built environment. She is the author of Sculptural Materiality in the Age of Conceptualism and is currently at work on a new book project, Alloys, American Sculpture and Architecture at Mid-Century, forthcoming from Princeton University Press, which has the support of fellowships from the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. You can read further about her accomplishments on our website, but in short, she is the leading academic voice on works such as Orpheus and Apollo, and we're in for a real treat. Please welcome Marin R. Sullivan.
Thank you so much, Sean and Caroline. I'm going to switch over here to the PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this in full screen. Great. So, you know, this is a really interesting moment for me to be talking about Orpheus and Apollo. I think as an art historian, you know, it's always nice when your current research and work can be relevant. I wish mine wasn't as this relevant at this particular moment in terms of having written a lot on Orpheus and Apollo. But I'm certainly very happy tonight to be able to discuss a little bit its importance and contextualize practice a little bit more. I figured I'd start here with this kind of incredible spread taken actually by the photographer Bruce Davidson for Vogue magazine in 1963 that of course features Richard Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo in the background. I also thought I would start with this particular image from from Life magazine. Shortly after the Philharmonic Hall opened in 1962, and I thought I would, you know, really just highlight this spread because when Philharmonic Hall opened in '62, it was met with great fanfare. CBS had a full special, a televised special on the opening. Life magazine, of course, as we see here in the spread, kind of breathlessly covered it. The opening events were attended by luminaries such as Jacqueline Kennedy and very much the building, which has already been mentioned, was designed by Max Abramovich. This was the first of 5 major structures designed for Lincoln Center. And in terms of how Life magazine, just even in this spread and in its coverage of the opening, described the building and the opening as having 5 glass enclosed decks, glittering in the night like a glorified Mississippi steamboat where culture and glamour walked affectionately side by side, and that used people as a decoration. And visible in these photographs, both from the interior and exterior of Philharmonic Hall, was of course another type of decoration, right? And that being Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo. So you can kind of see that in those 2 shots, those 2 images. And Life magazine, I think, very curiously described Lippold's, which wasn't completely finished at the time of Philharmonic's opening, as an unfinished space sculpture by Richard Lippold that looks like an explosion in a woodpile. So Carolyn mentioning that notion of an exploded matter, very much coming from contemporary criticism. 3 months later, Lippold would fully complete the piece of these 2 kind of sculptural masses that comprise Orpheus and Apollo. They covered the entire length of the grand foyer, stretching 190 feet in length and extending 39 feet in height. Together, the forms weighed 5 tons, but even as it did partially on opening night at Philharmonic Hall, the 190 sheets of highly polished once metal and steel wire convey a surprising, I would argue, shimmering lightness. Now, as I mentioned, and as others have mentioned, Orpheus and Apollo was one of a number of prominent sculptures that were commissioned, made specifically for or purchased for the Lincoln Center campus, which, you know, itself was a fairly highly controversial project, architectural project of the 1960s. And in these, the lower right-hand slides, you can see it's circled probably 2 of the most notable pieces installed at Lincoln Center, Alexander Calder's La Guichet and Henry Henry Moore's reclining figure, Lincoln Center, which was made specifically for the site. Richard Lippold may no longer evoke the same level of name recognition as somebody like Calder or Moore, but as has already been mentioned this evening, in the 1950s, his complex, highly engineered sculptural projects really did make him the kind of one of the high profile kind of go-to sculptors amongst the modernist architecture set. Architectural commissions or large-scale artworks created for specific architectural structures or projects had a kind of moment in the immediate post-war period. So roughly 1945 to 1965, there was a kind of explosion of commissioned works, of an attempt between architect and artist to collaborate. And of course, sculpture is particularly predisposed to these types of commissions as it shares a similar language with architecture. These projects, and again, as Sean mentioned, I've been working on a book project that's now completed that looks at some of these examples, and certainly, you know, Noguchi, Calder, Lippold, and Harry Bertoia, who was mentioned in terms of, he was Willem Valentiner's son-in-law, actually. So another kind of interesting connection there in the art world, very small place, particularly in the post-war period. These projects, though, and we see Richard Lippold's Flight up in the upper right-hand corner. These projects were hotly debated, you know, widely covered in both the art and architecture press as well as the kind of popular press. And they were at the time celebrated as some of the most significant works of not just kind of architectural commissions, but of mid-century modern or modern sculpture, American sculpture. They also, though, kind of in the same breath as they're being heralded as these significant pieces, they're also being derided as decoration, right? And decoration, certainly at this moment, is a four-letter word. Hilton Kramer, the art critic, famously refers to Lippold as America's foremost public decorator at one point, and that was not meant as a compliment, right? So this idea of kind of functionality of art being used in a way that had a purpose, right? That was commissioned, that was not made just for the personal expression of the artist, was something that was equally kind of criticized, right? So it's this interesting moment when these things are being heralded and also derided. And certainly, you know, I came to work on Richard Lippold because of this larger book project, because when you look at who are the artists that are constantly being tapped to do these architectural commissions, Lippold's name absolutely comes up, and he is responsible for completing some of the most well-known of these commissions. And certainly, as Phyllis was talking in terms of the Four Seasons, you know, he is somebody who very quickly, and I think this is why architects continue to return to him, and he kind of gets a reputation amongst modernist architects. He becomes known as Philip Johnson referred to him as the architectural sculptor, right? Like he's the one to go to. And certainly, I think a quality that became crucial was that the sculptor was willing to work with architects to kind of acquiesce or navigate their whims, right? Architecture is always going to be the kind of total work of art. You know, it's what these sculptures kind of fit into. But I would certainly say that what becomes really crucial in Lippold's work, as well as others like Bertoia, Calder, and Noguchi, is that this isn't just decoration. This isn't just ornament, right? I think what becomes really noticeable is, especially about these works that were created for kind of interior threshold spaces, right? Not the outdoor plaza work that will become associated with large scale public sculpture as we get later into the 60s and 1970s. But these works that were done, you know, for lobbies, for bar spaces, for these, again, threshold spaces, really took on a structural characteristic, right? They start to borrow from the language of architecture and vice versa. So these works, you know, I would certainly argue are fundamental to both the history of mid-century modern architecture, but also American sculptural history and American art history of the mid-20th century. And, you know, in regards to the Four Seasons space, this was something that Johnson noted, that if you pulled it out of there, the sculpture would suffer, as would the architecture, right? And I think that's very much true, certainly with Four Seasons, but also with Orpheus and Apollo, right? the sculpture doesn't exist without the form of the architecture, but also the architecture is greatly diminished by removing the sculpture, because these two things were so intermeshed with one another. Perhaps an even more an even similar comparison would be the work that he does in 1966, that Lippold does in 1966 for the Jesse H. Jones Hall in Houston. And this is a work that is still in situ and that is actually very well cared for. And again, you kind of get these like twin forms of metal that very much are in response to the space age. And of course, that's something that's acutely felt in Houston with its connections to NASA and industry. So this was certainly something he was doing and exploring across the board, but each commission, each work very much had its own characteristics, very much was, again, responding to the specifics of that architecture of that space. Now, the integration of art and architecture was, as I mentioned, very contested and complex, especially at the time. This was something that maybe even at first glance to us seems a little bit incongruous, right? These kind of clean lines of modernist architecture, devoid of extraneous decoration. And so why kind of add something into this space? The noted, wonderful, amazing architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable suggested that the relationship actually wasn't about integration, but rather it was about juxtaposition or contrast, right? That there was something about these kind of humanizing elements of the sculpture that actually contrasted with those kind of clean, harsh lines of modernist architecture. I would like to suggest, though, that it's neither integration nor a juxtaposition, but actually one closer of synthesis, right? Of two things coming together to combine to make a stronger piece, right? So again, it's the architecture remains architecture, the sculpture remains sculpture, but when those two things come together in a really thoughtful, conscious way, something new gets created, right? And that, I think, is the danger of removing a piece like Orpheus and Apollo from Lincoln Center, is that, you know, it diminishes everything in its wake, right? It's not just, oh, we need to keep the sculpture up, it's a great sculpture. It's actually about what the sculpture does with its architecture, with the synthesis that was created between Abramovitz and Lippold in 1963. And certainly the way that sculpture has this remarkable ability to reflect and transmute and inhabit architecture, right? It's not just something you put up on the wall. It's not just some sort of shiny bauble or decoration, but it's really about how it changes the space and about how the viewer or visitor navigates that space. A little bit of background about Richard Lippold, and some of this has been discussed already, but I think it bears repeating. He was born in Milwaukee in 1915 and educated as an industrial designer at the School of the Art Institute, and will work for dairy companies before moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to teach at the University of Michigan for a number of years, and then moving to New York. He establishes his career in the 50s and 60s as a sculptor of space, right? These are the kind of terminologies that get, or the phrases that get applied to Lippold pretty consistently. And again, we definitely need to keep in mind that space is a very loaded term in the 50s and 60s, certainly in terms of spaceflight dominance, you know, during the Cold War, but also just in terms of a building boom that was radically transforming the built environment in the United States at the time. Lippold's metal constructions, like Orpheus and Apollo, might seem detached from this history, but they very much were shaped not only, as Lippold described it, by the Midwest prairies of his youth, but by the scientific innovation and kind of cosmic explorations and discoveries happening in the immediate post-war period. The artist actually declared to Time magazine shortly after completing Orpheus and Apollo that faith no longer resided in pyramids or cathedrals, but rather in space, energy, and communications. So this is certainly something that's very much on his mind as he's creating this. And for him, you know, declaring that in the 20th century, we don't look at things, we look through them. This idea of transparency and reflection and explosion of matter shouldn't just be thought as kind of modernist abstraction, but very much a response to the changing conditions of the space age and the post-atomic world. Philharmonic Hall certainly provided Lippold with an opportunity to explore these themes and do it on a very high profile, large scale. He was thinking with this commission as an opportunity to very much explore sculptural modes of transparency and reflectivity. We're looking here at an architectural model of the Grand Foyer, which is again located on that second floor at Philharmonic Hall. And this space really was the kind of design showcase of this building, right? Arguably not its most important space, that's where the performances would have happened, but this was the piece this was the area of the building visible from the sidewalk, from the public spaces beyond Lincoln Center. You can also see from this model, and I'm sure most of you have visited this space, that it's also pretty narrow in terms of how it relates to the building as a whole. And Abramovich had initially kind of envisioned some sort of hanging chandelier for this space, and actually goes as far to approach the Lohmeyer company, which will end up doing, of course, the famous Sputnik chandeliers for the Metropolitan Opera House later in the 60s. He decided, though, that the Lohmeyer chandeliers would not have enough delicacy to them. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, kind of smaller scale chandeliers, and then him ending up commissioning this massive kind of metal sculpture as being more delicate, right? That's the kind of feeling he wanted. Abramovich by 1961 was convinced that only a sculpture could float in space, right? These are actually Abramovich's word here, float in space and relate in a contemporary manner to the interior of the foyer. And he became convinced that Lippold, who he described as the best space commander around, was the only artist for this job. So this isn't something that, you know, Lippold is going up against other artists or having to submit proposals for. He's already identified by Abramovich here as kind of the only person he wanted to have for the Philharmonic Hall. As we've heard in Marilyn Karp's recording, certainly the history of how the commission came to be was kind of an epic saga in and of itself, and very much a piece that took a small group of assistants and lots of kind of upheaval, working around other individuals and teams of people, crews from Italy laying down the travertine flooring or the marble flooring. And so certainly we have a work that was an achievement just getting it into this space, and the mathematical precision that took to hang this piece. But I want to underscore the fact that for Lippold, every aspect of this piece, every aspect of the work's materiality was carefully and consciously thought through and selected. You know, the one consistency across Lippold's practice is very much precision, right? And if you look at kind of his preparatory drawings or his models, you know, these are always things that are abstract, but precise. And in this case, we have this kind of geometric abstract formation, these two distinct masses of metal that come together to definitely convey the kind of suggestion of being two figures in space, right? So as Joseph was discussing, this idea that for him, drawing on Greek mythology and the stories of Orpheus and Apollo as these kind of two figures, this is certainly something that, you know, might be in the back of Lippold's mind, and certainly adds a connection to the function of this building and this space. But I also think that Lippold's work functions as well as it does because it doesn't get too mired down in narrative associations, because it isn't, you know, about a kind of representation of a metaphor or a Greek myth, right? It does more than that. And certainly it achieves that through its materiality. And one of the ways, of course, it's doing this is through the surface shine of the materials that he uses. He worked exclusively in metal throughout his career, or almost exclusively in metal, save for his kind of two-dimensional works. And so, like his contemporaries, who again also turned to metal at mid-century, if you can think of something like David Smith, for example, the kind of sculptor par excellence of American post-war modernism, Lippold was not about the kind of roughly hewn, expressionistic, welded, direct welded surfaces or techniques, right? He also kind of eschewed materials like Corten steel, or these kind of more, you know, rougher textured metals, choosing instead to work in stainless steels, aluminums, and in this case, Muntz metal. He was also emphatic about not covering up the surface of the metal, right? He wanted the material to speak as it was. He didn't want it to be something else, right? So there's a way in which he wanted to really bring out the natural qualities of whatever chosen metal he had selected. He stated, generally my materials are so polished as to reflect light, and in doing so, they seem to dematerialize, thus emphasizing the spatial quality of the work. And again, I think that speaks to kind of the consciousness that he puts forth in every decision he makes with his work. It's not just like, oh, this is a pretty metal, but what can this metal do for the space? What can this metal do for the sculpture? And certainly, you know, the end result here are pieces that look somewhat similar to chandeliers. They kind of share that decorative language, but also very much was something that he was thinking about how it worked in the total space. And I show you here a piece that he does for the Inland Steel Building in Chicago in 1957, Radiant Eye. And I show this work not only to give you another sense of Lippold's tremendous contribution and attention to site specificity with the Inland Steel Building, but also because this was another project that was lit by the noted modernist lighting designer Richard Kelly, who will also, you know, be involved in actually a number of projects that Richard Lippold completes over the course of his career. So we have this idea of shine and reflectivity in Orpheus and Apollo, again, not just being something that's pretty or about reflectivity, but again, really about being how sculpture can activate and make dynamic its environment and the surrounding architecture. Certainly this is something that's amplified at night because of Kelly's lighting design, but even during the daylight hours, and we can see here in this image as kind of light is streaming in through the windows of the grand foyer, the surface and condition of the sculpture changes, right? And this was a conscious desire on Lippold's part to create this, to create a work that had this golden glow, that had this warm tone to it. He originally actually wanted to use gold-plated strips of aluminum, and as you can imagine, gold plating would have been extraordinarily more expensive. Muntz metal, again, which is a kind of modern, very malleable brass alloy made up of 60% copper and 40% zinc, provided a much more kind of affordable option, though it actually is heavier, and so it required, again, collaborating with the architect, going back to Abramovitz, who ended up reinforcing the ceiling based on Lippold's design. And I think this is another crucial way, right, where you have to have an architect and an artist willing to work together, willing to make modifications. This was the same case in Inland Steel when they actually moved back that black stone wall to, again, better accommodate the lighting and the form of the sculpture. So it's very much a process of working together, right? And this was something that Abramovitz was keen to do, and I think the work ends up being better because of it. I also just want to note that the wires were not simply just a support system for the work. This wasn't just like, oh, this is how we're going to hang these plates and the plates are what's important. He actually very much felt that the wires were just as important to the sculpture as the kind of Muntz metal plates themselves. He really wanted them to hang from a single point as possible, so he didn't want to have too many connecting points, but he really did think about how those wires would create different reflections, different lighting effects, different ways of, again, making this inert static thing seem really dynamic within this space. So all of these different material choices with Lippold's work were a calculated and conscious decision. The steel wires and Muntz metal together allowed him to create dynamic, interconnected spatial and atmospheric effects in the space. But it also, and I think this is a crucial point, directly associated the sculpture with architecture. right? So it's really not about making this seem like traditional fine art or sculpture going on at the time, but really materially connecting his sculpture to industry, to science, and to the materials literally being used in the architecture for which his sculpture are being made. So there's a way in which Orpheus and Apollo and Abramovich's architecture share a material formal language, right? They are of the same moment, they are of the same materials. And I think this really helps synergize those two elements together. So we see, you know, the Muntz metal of Lippold's sculpture kind of echoing in the brass finishes and warm travertine interior of the architecture of Philharmonic Hall. And definitely, again, associations with post-war industry and scientific and new technologies. Lippold, again, just I'll return to this model that he, again, that I think was already mentioned, was shown at the gallery prior to the completion of the piece, and that is discussed in Calvin Tompkins' profile in the New Yorker in 1963. Lippold actually doesn't come into the picture until maybe a little bit later on. Usually Lippold's preference, as I think most artists would be, very much was about getting in as soon as possible, really being part of those structural conversations, not just kind of being asked to bring something in later after the fact. But he really did want to take on as much of, he wanted to be involved in as many decisions as possible. And I think Abramovich's enthusiasm for Lippold and for what he ends up proposing as a possibility of the piece, again, really made it a successful, positive collaboration between those individuals. From the outset, Lippold knew that his sculpture was going to have to contend with the great open space of the Grand Foyer, that it would need to pull together the two ends of this long, narrow space to, as he said it, relieve the feeling of extreme elongation, both horizontal and vertical. And what we actually see as an end result, these kind of fluid arcing of these two metal forms that cut the architectural space with dynamic openness, or as Time magazine noted, quote, without removing an inch of space, right? This is not reductive, it's additive. And really what we see as a result is Lippold's work, his final piece, enlivening what was a grand space, but also a kind of basic space, right? I think, again, without the Lippold sculpture, the architecture just seems greatly diminished. Stuart Preston, I kind of want to leave you with this last quote from Stuart Preston, the art critic at the time for the New York Times. He, in his review of the sculpture, noted, quote, "Orpheus and Apollo can thus be looked at in two ways. As a decorative object, sparkling and reflecting rays of light, it catches and holds the eye. More importantly, its geometric irregularity animates the whole interior space cradling it, and relives the severely plain and unadorned character of the architecture." And I would say, end quote there, I would say the ability of Orpheus and Apollo to animate, to tie together and offer these explosive breaks within Abramovich's protracted space was indeed an example of a successful integration or synergy between art and architecture. But that's only the case if we acknowledge that part of the sculpture's task was to help resolve those deficiencies in the architecture, not just adorn its surfaces.